Now our next talk. Someone I've known for quite a while, actually. Part of the reason that you're all in this room right now is because we got kind of drunk in a basement in Prague in like 2008, 2009, something like that. And we're, complaining about documentation being awful. And, as they say, the rest was history. Ask me about it if you want to hear the full story. Anyway, this is Alex Gaynor talking about documenting domain-specific knowledge.
Hi everybody, I'm Alex. Thank you for coming to listen today. I got my start writing software as well as writing documentation at the same time with a project called Django. Django is a Python web framework that came out of a small town newspaper in a city called Lawrence, Kansas. Django is a very strong culture of documentation, which I believe comes out of the fact that its two original creators have degrees in journalism and English. When people come to Django's documentation, what are they looking for? Broadly, they come in two categories. They're people who have already used Django, and they're looking for reference material or introductory material for some sort of subcomponent. I'm not concerned with those users. For the most part, above all else, these users are concerned with the completeness of the documentation. They have a lot of context for everything we're trying to tell them, and we could throw almost anything at them and they'd sort of figure it out. The other set of users who come to our documentation are entirely new to Django. They want to make a website, because that's what you do with Django. So we have these users, they're totally fresh to Django, they come to our tutorial, and they want to make a website. Who are these people? What do they already know? In truth, we've never really written down explicitly what the user profile our tutorial is for. But reading through the lines, one thing is very clear. We assume you're familiar with how the web works. We go to quite a bit of effort to make our tutorial digestible to people from a variety of different use cases. People who are new to Python, people who are new to databases, and of course people who are new to Django itself. But not new to the web. If you are familiar with how the web works and what the request-response cycle is, our documentation is probably completely opaque to you. Django is a tool within the domain of building web applications, and it's made a decision that it's a tool for practitioners within that domain, not something for people to use because they don't want to learn that domain, or as a place to learn that domain afresh. It's a perfectly valid decision. Sometimes people don't care and just want to get something done, but Django is not the tool for that. This talk is about writing documentation for these narrow domains. And specifically, the use cases that inspired this talk are writing documentations for developers, but I suspect there's things for other audiences. So what's in a domain? A domain is any time a person can be totally ignorant about a subject while being an expert in everything else. I'm particularly interested in a use case different from Django's. I'm interested in documentation for domains where not only are people ignorant, they want to remain ignorant, and the tool wants to enable that. Why do I care about this? For the past year, I've been working on a Python cryptography library. Developers don't know anything about cryptography for the most part. I don't know anything about cryptography. But if you screw it up, the consequences can be bad, and the feedback you tend to get from your users is terrible. Do you know what happens when you use a cryptography library correctly? You get random data that looks like garbage out. Do you know what happens when you use a cryptography library incorrectly? You get random data that looks like garbage out. So you can't count on your users to know when they've done something wrong. So we think documentation is important. There's a few of us working on this, and we're writing software because that's about the only thing we know how to do. But we're also writing documentation because as we got into writing this library, we found out that most of the other tools have really poor documentation, and so we need to be an education project as much as we're a software project. This is one of my favorite quotes that sort of informs how I think about documentation. It might be the best thing ever, but guess what? If you invent the best thing ever and don't write any docs for it for 13 years, you lose. This is how we feel about this. Documentation is strictly required. We thought we were getting into this because the other software was bad. It was only when we really dove into it that we found out their documentation was even worse. One of the questions we grapple with is, can you document around a usability problem? This is a question that a lot of times comes up when dealing with legacy software, right? Okay, we know the software is bad. Do we have to actually fix the software, or can we just write some documentation for it? The conventional answer is no. You can't just document around these problems, but I don't think that's quite right. When something is utterly unintuitive, we can write docs to tell people how to use it, and they might follow them. What you can't document around is people's assumptions. If people think they know something, how something works, and you don't shock them out of that viewpoint, and your software doesn't conform to that viewpoint, they'll never learn. They'll just keep trying to go through applying their assumptions to your software and getting bad results. Sometimes, to overcome our egos, we need to be forced to read the documentation. And so I've come up with this idea that documentation and design are a partnership. Who here owns an iPhone? Who here has read the user's manual for their iPhone? Right. Who here works on a product that's as well designed as the iPhone? Yeah, me neither. So we need to write documentation for our products because they're not quite that well designed. But it's not all or nothing. Documentation partners with design to create usability. So this is sort of some high-level thoughts I have about why what we're doing is important and how it applies to our work. But the rest of this is concrete advice I've taken from the last year on how we can do this better. The most important thing is to pick an audience. It doesn't matter who it is, it works better if it's your actual audience. And then you need to write documentation for that audience and for nobody else. People who use my software is not an audience. An audience is a set of knowledge that you expect these people to come with. It's the set of goals they have, their takeaways from using their audience. You might need to write some of your documentation multiple times, once for each one of these personas. That's fine. That way your documentation will be useful for each person you write for. Otherwise, you're going to have something that's not very useful for everybody. The corollary to this is that you need to partition your users into multiple groups, and sometimes it's tricky for people to see what group they get into. Our solution to this problem was to try to make the software model our use cases. So we've divided our software into layers. One's for everyone, and another layer of our software that's just for experts. And then we document according to these layers. The best documentation I've ever read, I was able to read top to bottom like a novel. It's really popular, probably because it's easy, to write documentation in a very reference style, where everything is a link, everything takes you somewhere else. And of course, you often end up needing to read that something else to get the overall point. There's nothing wrong with extra reference links, additional material, but they should always be optional to read. If it's necessary, it needs to go inline to make sure people can follow what's going on and don't miss something that they thought was optional. If it's optional, it can be a link. But more importantly, if it's just there maybe as a curiosity, chuck the extra material out. Don't let digressions in your text distract your users. Probably the single most important thing we've tried to do with our documentation is eliminate any and all assumptions for it. We try not to use jargon, or if jargon is absolutely necessary, we explain it. No one needs to know that our encryption is a bijective mapping. So here's some examples of the opposite, where assumptions rule. This is from another cryptography library. So you can see we've got this thing called ECB, and it stands for Electronic Cookbook Mode. And so they've explained the initialism. We know what ECB stands for. But if you want to actually know what this does or why it's significant, the link takes you somewhere else. This information should be front and center. There's no way for you to use this data without actually knowing what it's for, unless you come in with a ton of context, which most users don't. I particularly love the final example, where the only documentation is, oh, don't use this. It's clearly really important that it be listed here, right? It doesn't even know the link to anywhere else for extra information. So this first element, it turns out that despite the fact that it's the first, and it's not warned against, it's an incredibly bad idea to use this if you can avoid it. The documentation doesn't tell you that. If you follow that link, there's about a paragraph about this, and like the third or fourth sentence explains that it might be a bad idea sometimes. In reality, it should be in like red print with sparkles and like fireworks going off telling you, hey, don't use this. Or even better, it should be documented somewhere totally separately, out of the way, not next to the things that are actually a good idea. And of course, if you don't believe that design and documentation are a partnership, of course the actual default mode, that if you don't specify a mode, you get the wildly insecure one. Most users probably never even make it to the documentation to see that it's a bad idea, possibly. They just use the default because it was specified for them. Nothing, in truth, that you wrote in the previous section could dissuade them, because they didn't even know they were making a choice. Be prescriptive. If you're an expert, you have subject matter expertise, you can make recommendations for your users. that they don't have the expertise to make themselves. Here's a typical sentence from cryptography documentation. The choice between AES and CHA-20 is partially informed by the availability of hardware acceleration such as AES-NI and PCL-MUL-QDQ. I guarantee you not one user who's ever read that sentence took anything away from it, other than there's a lot of letters they need to Google. Here's what our docs say in the same place. AES is a good default choice for encryption. This is much simpler, and it's true. It doesn't inform the users with all the knowledge they might need, or maybe even want. But it's better for most of our users, because people who have opinions about the way to do things probably aren't reading your documentation looking for that information. And more importantly, they're not part of our audience profile. Every once in a while, we get a bug report for a professional cryptographer who complains, I have to read through all this detail, all these explanations, just to get to these things I want. And usually our response is, sorry, this documentation is not for you. This documentation is for people who aren't familiar with this domain and for people who are actually looking to learn the domain, not for people who are just trying to apply some things they already know. Enable use cases. People who come to your library outside of your domain probably came to it because they wanted to solve a specific problem. If you can find out what those problems are, probably a lot of your users are trying to solve the same problems. You can write tutorials and other materials specifically for these people. Happy users will probably go through the reference material targeted specifically at them and never get to the rest. General purpose reference materials are fine, but I think for most use cases, they should be secondary to specialized tutorials. Composition is a great way to build software. It's a great way to do almost anything, dividing your problem into small chunks that can be developed independently and put together to form complete solutions. It's a great approach to building larger solutions, but often it can be problematic for documenting to new people. They're not familiar with how you connect all the pieces. They're not familiar with how they're combined. It's your job when writing documentation to connect the dots for them, to show them complete examples of how the individual pieces can be put together to solve bigger problems. One of the most valuable things we've done is we've gotten users who were just like us a couple months ago, no familiar with this material at all, and get them to follow our documentation. We'll give them a problem, something a real person might want to solve, and give them our docs and let them go at it. And don't let them use any other resource. Every time they start to reach for Google, we treat that as a bug in our documentation. If you don't have a test subject, I strongly recommend being dumber than your users. This is a great strategy. I'll personally vouch for it. One of the biggest challenges we have is our users often don't know what they don't know. This is one of the things that comes with learning new material. And say what you will about Donald Rumsfeld, but he has got great phrases. Nothing of consequence should ever depend on something a user doesn't know they don't know. And it's your documentation's responsibility to inform them of everything they ought to know. For us, this has meant that counterintuitively, we try not to provide a lot of defaults. We make recommendations, but we force our users to see when the choice is happening. This lets them understand what's going on without necessarily needing to make the decision themselves. We give them a recommendation, but they see that they're using that recommendation, and so they don't end up in situations where it was something totally important to do, but there was a default that was insecure or not appropriate for their situation. Whenever we get a question from a user about how do I do this, how do I solve this, we treat this as feedback against the documentation, something that we can improve. I'm from the open source world, so to me the corollary to this is not only should we take their feedback, we should enable them to act on their own feedback. By using tools that let our users contribute back, by encouraging them to try to help craft better documentation for themselves. Someone should be able to follow your tutorial and have something working in 30 minutes, is what I was once told. I met someone last night who described their user base as 16-year-olds on drugs who want to be Skrillex. In addition to that being the best description of an audience ever, we can all imagine that persona. It's not very patient. Turns out most of our users aren't that patient either. They're already going into something they know they don't know anything about, and they don't want to be hit with more challenges. Finding ways for your tutorials to give them intermediary wins, to see results quickly, is super valuable in getting them to continue to go through. One of the most important things for me to realize is Your users don't care about your domain. It's really important to you, but it's okay they don't care. Your domain is just an impediment to them getting in the way of doing their real job. I have a friend who teaches programming classes for scientists, and the thing he likes to say is that scientists treat programming as a tax they have to do in order to do research. It's something they don't want to do, but they have to get their jobs done. The library we're building is the same thing. It's something in the way, and we try to get out of the way. They'd much rather be doing something like actually building their project or learning to juggle or barbecuing. Every once in a while, somebody says thank you, and that has to be enough. Your software is just a means to an end for most of them. I'm Alex Gaynor. I work at Rackspace as a software engineer. I'm an active member of the Python community. The slides for this talk will be online at that URL. Thank you very much. Questions?
All right. See, we have at least one question.
Thanks, Alex. That was great. I had a question about your testing. You said you never let the people that you're giving the test to use any other reference, and if you do, you consider that a challenge to the work you've done.
Yeah.
At least in my domain, it's assumed that every user will immediately go to Google when they have any question about anything. They may not, they don't even know we have documentation. Google is their documentation. Do you think it's realistic to tell them you can't use another source?
No, it's not totally realistic, but it sets a bar for us to reach for. We know people are going to augment our documentation with Wikipedia, with their previous assumptions. We just want to make sure that what they get, sort of by combining all these sources, is the right result, which is not, that doesn't lead them astray. And more importantly, we want to make sure that if there's specific information that we need to include in our documentation to use something correctly, that's there for them. Maybe part of your audience profile is they have certain familiarities, they have certain places they already go to look for information. Part of our challenge for ourselves was writing documentation that was truly assumption-free, that people could really come to as, I'm a programmer who knows nothing about this field. If your audience is different, I think the parameters that you want to test your documentation with will be different as well. Oh, yeah. Sure.
Are you just writing something down? Any other questions? No. Thank you, Alex.
All right, thank you very much.